Most people imagine national parks as quiet places where nothing much happens after dark. The truth is, the hours after closing are usually the most unpredictable. I worked as a ranger in a large forest recreation area for several years, and part of my job was doing night patrols once the gates were locked and visitors were supposed to be gone. The campground I was assigned to was spread out across several wooded loops, each with about 20 sites tucked between tall pines and uneven patches of brush. During the day, it stayed busy. Families grilling dinner, kids riding bikes between campsites, the usual noise of people trying to enjoy a weekend outside. But by the time night patrol started, it was supposed to be completely empty. My shift usually began a little after sunset. I'd drive slowly through each loop, checking that campers had packed up and that nobody had decided to stay past closing. Most people cooperated when you reminded them the campground shut down at dusk. Every once in a while, someone would try to argue, but eventually they'd leave. After a while, the routine became predictable. That night started the same way. The air had cooled down after a warm afternoon, and a light wind was moving through the trees. My headlights swept across empty picnic tables and fire pits as I made my way through the first campground loop. The gravel road crunched under the tires of the ranger truck, the only real sound in the woods. Site after site was empty. A few abandoned fire rings still had faint smoke drifting up from them, but that wasn't unusual. People always thought pouring water on a fire meant it was completely out. I finished checking the first loop and turned toward the second one, which sat farther back in the forest. That section was always darker because the trees were thicker, and the road curved enough that your headlights never illuminated more than a few sites at a time. As I drove in, everything looked normal at first. Empty parking spots, dark campsites, no tents, no lanterns, no people moving around. Then my headlights caught something farther down the loop, a pickup truck. It was parked crooked in one of the campsites near the back, partially hidden by the trees. For a second, I assumed it belonged to someone who was just finishing packing up. That happens sometimes. People lost track of time and stayed later than they were supposed to. But the closer I got, the stranger it seemed. The truck wasn't running. No interior lights were on. There were no lanterns or flashlights anywhere around the campsite. Just the dark outline of the vehicle sitting there in the quiet. I slowed the ranger truck and pulled up along the gravel road beside the site. The place looked empty. No tent, no cooler, no chairs. Just the pickup truck. I shut off my engine and sat there for a moment, listening. The forest had gone completely still, the way it sometimes does at night when there aren't any people around. Even the wind had died down. Usually, when someone overstays, they're right there at the campsite. You see them packing bags or folding chairs the moment your headlights show up. But this site felt different. Whoever owned that truck wasn't anywhere I could see. And for the first time that night, I started to wonder if someone had left it there, or if they were still somewhere in the woods nearby. I grabbed my flashlight from the center console and stepped out of the ranger truck. The moment the engine shut off, the silence around the campground became a lot more noticeable. Gravel crunched under my boots as I walked toward the campsite. My flashlight beam swept slowly across the ground, catching the pale dirt of the parking spot and the edge of a wooden picnic table. Up close, the truck looked older, a dark pickup with a dull paint job that had seen better years. The bed was empty, except for a length of rope and a small plastic container rolling slightly in the wind. I stopped a few feet from the driver's door and listened. Nothing. No voices. No movement. Not even the sound of someone shifting around in the woods. "Park Ranger!" I called out into the trees. My voice carried farther than I expected. "Campground's closed for the night." Normally, that was enough to get someone's attention. People would step out from behind a tree or call back from their tent, usually sounding a little embarrassed. But this time, there was no response. I moved my flashlight beam across the rest of the campsite. The picnic table was completely clear. The fire ring was cold and full of old ash, like it hadn't been used that evening. There weren't any coolers, sleeping bags, or supplies that suggested someone had been camping there recently. It was just the truck. That's when I walked over to the driver's side window and shined my flashlight inside. The interior was messy. Fast food wrappers were scattered across the passenger seat and floorboards. A crumpled paper bag sat near the center console, and a half-empty soda cup rested in the cup holder. But there were no keys in the ignition. I placed a hand on the hood of the truck. Cold. If someone had driven it there recently, the engine would still have some warmth to it. Even after half an hour, you could usually feel it. This felt like the truck had been sitting there for quite a while. I stepped back and looked around again, turning slowly in a full circle with the flashlight. The beam moved through rows of trees that surrounded the campsite on 3 sides, tall pines with thick trunks and heavy shadows between them. Beyond the first few rows, the forest turned into complete darkness. Again, I called out, "Hello?" The word echoed slightly through the woods, then disappeared. Still nothing. And that was the part that started to bother me. Even when people try to hide from rangers, you usually hear something. A twig snapping, someone whispering, the rustle of someone moving through leaves. The forest around that campsite felt too still. I took a few steps toward the tree line, letting the flashlight beam move deeper between the trunks. The light cut through maybe 20 or 30 feet of woods before fading into darkness. Anyone standing farther back than that could easily stay hidden. I stood there for a moment, listening harder than before. At first, there was nothing. Then somewhere out in the trees, faint but clear enough to notice, I thought I heard the sound of something shifting through the leaves. Not an animal moving quickly, more like someone taking a careful step. I stood still for a few seconds after hearing it, trying to decide if it was actually a person or just some animal moving through the brush. Deer were common in that area, and they could sound surprisingly heavy when they stepped through dry leaves. But animals usually keep moving. Whatever I had heard stopped almost immediately. The silence that followed felt different than before, less like an empty forest and more like something waiting. I turned the flashlight toward the direction the sound had come from and walked slowly toward the tree line. The beam moved over roots and low brush as I stepped off the packed dirt of the campsite and onto the uneven forest floor. "Hello?" I called again. My voice sounded smaller out there. "If you're out here, the campground's closed. I just need you to come back to the site so we can talk." No answer. I moved the flashlight deeper between the trees, sweeping it left and right. The beam jumped from trunk to trunk, lighting up small patches of leaves before disappearing again into darkness. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined the sound. Then, something shifted farther back. It was subtle, just a small movement behind one of the trees, maybe 30 or 40 feet away, but it was enough to catch my attention. I held the flashlight steady and aimed the beam directly at that spot. At first, all I saw were trees. Then the light landed on something that didn't match the rest of the forest. A person. They were standing perfectly still between 2 of the pines, far enough back that most of their body stayed in shadow, but close enough that the light caught the front of them for a second. A man. At least, I'm fairly sure it was a man. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there with his arms hanging loosely at his sides. From that distance, I couldn't make out much about his face, but I could tell he was looking directly at me, watching. I raised the flashlight slightly, trying to see him better. "Hey!" I called out. "You the owner of that truck?" The man didn't respond. He didn't step forward either. For a few seconds, he just stayed there in the beam of the flashlight, quiet and unmoving. Something about that felt wrong.
Most people who get caught somewhere they're not supposed to be either start explaining themselves right away or try to act like nothing's going on. This guy did neither. He simply watched. Then, without saying a word, he slowly took a step backward. The movement was careful, almost deliberate, like he didn't want to make any noise. "Hold on," I said, taking a couple of steps forward. The beam of my flashlight bounced across the trees as I moved, and for a moment it slipped off him. By the time I corrected it, he had already stepped farther back. Another step, then another, each one putting him deeper into the darkness where the light couldn't quite reach. "Sir?" I called again, a little louder this time. No response. Within a few seconds, the beam was only hitting empty trees. The man had backed far enough into the forest that I couldn't see him anymore, but I had the strong feeling he hadn't gone very far. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of the flashlight, hidden between the trees, he was still standing in the dark, and he was still watching me.
For a moment, I stood there with the flashlight pointed into the trees, hoping I'd see the man step forward again. But the forest stayed dark and empty. After about another minute of calling out and getting no response, I decided there wasn't much point going deeper into the woods alone. Rangers aren't supposed to wander off trail at night unless there's a real emergency. Too easy to get turned around, especially in thick forest like that. Whoever the guy was, he knew I was there now. If he wanted to talk, he could come back to the campsite. So I slowly backed out of the tree line and stepped onto the dirt clearing again. My flashlight moved across the truck one more time, checking the area out of habit. Everything looked exactly the same. The empty picnic table, the cold fire ring, the silent pickup truck sitting in the parking spot. I walked back to my vehicle and opened the driver's door. The interior light flicked on, cutting a bright square into the darkness around me. I kept my flashlight in one hand while I leaned inside to set it on the seat. That's when I heard it, a soft metallic click somewhere behind me. I froze for a second, listening. Then came the sound of an engine turning over. I turned around just as the pickup's headlights flashed on. The sudden brightness lit up the entire campsite, throwing long shadows across the trees. The engine rumbled to life like it had never been cold at all. For a split second, I just stared at it, trying to understand what I was seeing. Then I noticed movement near the driver's door. The man from the woods stepped out of the darkness and climbed into the truck. He moved quickly, but not in a panicked way, more like someone who had simply been waiting for the right moment. The door shut, the truck idled for a second. I walked a few steps toward the vehicle and raised my hand, half expecting the driver to roll down the window so we could talk. But the window stayed up. Through the windshield, I could barely see his silhouette behind the steering wheel. His face was mostly hidden in shadow. The truck shifted into gear. "Hold on," I said, though he could probably barely hear me through the glass. The pickup rolled forward out of the campsite and onto the gravel loop road. As it passed my Ranger truck, the headlights briefly lit up the interior of my vehicle and the surrounding trees. For just a second, I got a clearer look at the driver. It was the same man I'd seen between the trees. His head was turned slightly in my direction, but his expression was hard to read in the glare of the lights. He didn't wave, didn't nod, didn't say anything. He just kept driving. The truck moved slowly down the campground road, tires crunching over gravel until the sound faded into the forest. Within a minute, the headlights disappeared around the curve of the loop. And just like that, the campground was quiet again. I stood there for a while thinking about what had just happened. The truck had been cold when I touched the hood, cold enough that it must have been sitting there for quite some time, which meant the man hadn't just stepped away for a quick walk. He'd been out there in the woods long before I arrived, standing somewhere in the dark, watching the campsite, watching the truck, and once I got there, watching me. Night patrols like that were supposed to be routine. Most of the time they were.
But every now and then you run into someone in the woods who clearly doesn't want to be found. And the strange part is, they usually see you long before you ever see them. Which brings me to another night patrol that still bothers me more than that one ever did. Because that time, the person hiding out there never showed themselves at all.